Okay, we're studying in the book of Daniel. Isn't this a fun book? I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. If you had to kind of summarize the book of Daniel, it is all about the providence of our God, the absolute majestic power and care of the God of the universe, and how He works with faithful people to carry out His plan in His kingdom. But it can probably be summarized in that statement that Daniel made in Daniel chapter 4 as he recorded what the purpose of the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar was being taught as God humbled him and turned him into essentially an animal for 7 years. And the lesson was what? The Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and He gives kingdoms to whom He wills. And I'd like to remind you of that for a minute. I'd like to go through a couple of scriptures before we enter into Daniel chapter 5. Go with me to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 8. In Isaiah chapter 8, beginning in verse 6. Inasmuch as these people refuse the waters of Shiloh that flow softly and rejoice in Rezin and in Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord brings up over them the waters of the river and the strong and mighty, the king of Assyria and all his glory. He will go up over his channels and go over all his banks, and he will pass through Judah. He will overflow and pass over. He will reach up to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings will fill the breadth of your land and Emmanuel. Very colorful, descriptive language of the coming of Assyria against the northern kingdom. This is just one of a number of places that God, through His prophets, warns the northern kingdom that their idolatry and their rebellion against Him are going to result in His judgment. And the important point here is that it is Assyria, really a very evil nation. If you do any reading about Assyria, which dominated the world just before this time, they were really nasty folks. I guess the only parallel would be probably ISIS. They were those kinds of people. They not only were brutal, but their brutality was intended to intimidate. So they just did some horrific things. But they controlled that portion of the world for some period of time. But the point to be made here is the reason that they rose up to that place was because God allowed them to rise up to that place, because His purpose was to chasten the people of the north, His people, the northern kingdoms. So Assyria was essentially a tool of God. Go with me to Jeremiah. Keep your fingers in Isaiah for a minute. In Jeremiah chapter 25, well, go back to Isaiah for a minute. We're in the same place. Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, in Isaiah 10, verse 5, he says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger and staff, in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him against an ungodly nation and against the people of my wrath. I will give him charge to seize the spoil and to take prey." But it says, woe to Assyria, because God is going to use Assyria for a period of time, and then God is going to take them down. Go with me to Jeremiah chapter 25. (9 through 12). "Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, will bring them against this land, against its inhabitants, and against these nations all around, and will utterly destroy them and make them an astonishment and the hissing and the perpetual desolations." And then down at 11, "And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And then it will come to pass, when 70 years are completed, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation and the land of the Chaldeans for their iniquity, says the Lord, and I will make it a perpetual desolation. I will raise up Babylon for 70 years. For what reason? To take the southern kingdom into captivity, into Babylon, for that period of time, as my chasing for their idolatry and their sin. Now remember, God has warned these people for several hundred years. This is not and should not be a surprise to them. But there is the point that God's patience does run out. And so, he raised up Assyria to take out the north. That happened in 722 BC. And now he raises up Babylon to take out Assyria and take the southern kingdom into Babylon for 70 years. He dispersed the north, but he took the south into a captivity, just as he promises through his prophets. But at the end of that time, he will punish Babylon, because Babylon is still an evil nation, and we will see that as we move into this next section. Go with me to Jeremiah 50. Verse 29 to 31. Call together the archers against Babylon, and all you who bend the bow encamped against it all around. Let none of them escape. Repay her according to her work, according to all she has done. Do to her, for she has been proud against the Lord, against the Holy One of Israel. God uses those that love him and obey him. God uses those who are his enemies, because the Most High rules in all the kingdoms of men. Go with me to Isaiah again. In Isaiah 44. This is a fascinating prophecy. Recognize now, Isaiah is prophesying over 200 years before this event. So Isaiah 44:28. He says, "Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Thus say to the Lord, to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut." We'll talk about that in a minute. There's one called Cyrus who is coming, and this one coming, named Cyrus, shall allow my people to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And that's where we are as we come to Daniel chapter 5. We are at 739 BC, and the time clock has run out for the nation of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is dead. He has been dead for about 23 years. The nation has been in decline since that time. Daniel is an old man. Daniel has faded from the scene within that country, although as we'll see, he is still the same man of godly character that he has always been. But it is, Daniel knows, the end of that 70-year period of Babylonian rule. Remember, Babylon was raised up to the world-dominating position, a nation that has never been more powerful. But it all happened within a 70-year period. The rise and the fall of Babylon traced over 70 years. They came and they went. Not that they weren't an ancient culture. They were. They were from the time of Genesis. They were the place of the Tower of Babel. They were at the beginning. But they were nothing at the time that we see Daniel. They were simply a little vassal nation under the authority of the Assyrians. But they came out of nowhere to rule the world for 70 years to do what? To prove that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. and he gives those kingdoms to whom he wills. So, Nebuchadnezzar died, and then there were a series of rulers for a short period of time, and I'm going to read their names to you because they will be on the test. Actually, I'm going to read the names to you because I just like the names. You will not remember these names. They will mean nothing to you and probably shouldn't. But here they go. When Nebuchadnezzar died, his son, Amel-Marduk, took over for 2 years. He was succeeded, because he was killed, by his son, Neralezer, for 4 years. Then, a child named Labishi-Marduk for a few months, and then a man named Nabonidus. Now here's a name that you might try to remember a little bit. Nabonidus is now the ruler of Babylon. But we're going to see that the chapter 5 focuses on a man named Belshazzar as the emperor or the ruler. And for a long time, the critics of Daniel said, aha, there is no Belshazzar. There's only a guy named Nabonidus. And then they found some scrolls that explained exactly what was going on at this time in history. You see, Nabonidus was not in the royal line, but he married Nitocris. She was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So that made Belshazzar the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So when we refer to Belshazzar as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, you'll see that several times, that is just a way of referring to that line of relationship, because in the ancient world they didn't have a word for grandfather. They simply used father to cover all of those relationships. So it seems like it's best to understand Belshazzar as the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus and Belshazzar ruled at the same time. The man and his son ruled at the same time. Nabonidus didn't want to stay in Babylon. He wanted to go worship the moon god in Arabia. And so he left for 10 years. He never entered the city of Babylon. And he turned that authority over to Belshazzar. So in fact, Belshazzar did rule within the city. As we pick up the historical account of chapter 5 in Daniel, then, the Persians are overrunning the world. Nabonidus has raised up an army and gone to meet Cyrus in battle, and he's been destroyed. Cyrus just took him out. The Persians are now literally outside the gates of Babylon. And they've been there, some estimates are, for 3 or 4 months. They're laying siege to this city. Now, you remember from last time that Babylon was a formidable city. It was heavily fortified, and it was huge. It's Herodotus, the Greek historian, that describes the walls of Babylon as 300 feet high, 30, 40 feet wide. That would be 20 stories. 14 miles on a side. Big place. Now, there's some disputes about the size of the walls. Other people say they couldn't possibly have been that high, and other people say, yeah, they were. But they were big, really big, very, very formidable. And the city was big enough to be self-sustaining. They could easily grow enough crops. They could easily raise enough animals to feed their population. In addition to that, the Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city, so they had all the water they needed. They had that big wall, and on that wall there were extensions of the wall, big towers that were another 150 feet high. Now that gives you great vantage to shoot at the people down below you. You know, you had huge military advantage. And then they had an inner wall inside of that. So even if you breached the outer wall, you still had another wall, which was also substantial, before you could get into the actual area where the palace was, which also was surrounded by a moat and another wall. So, the Persians are outside, seemingly frustrated, and the Babylonians are inside under Belshazzar. So even though their military is destroyed, Belshazzar is pretty confident that he's okay. In fact, he is so confident that he's throwing a party. He's throwing a party. So let's read. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of 1,000. Now, some would say, well, that's a good-sized party. You know, just let's invite 1,000 of our closest friends. Actually, in ancient times, though, there were far greater parties. You know, Alexander the Great threw some really big shindigs, you know, maybe 10, 15 times bigger than this. And other rulers are also recorded as having given huge, huge parties. In fact, you can probably Google some of them on the internet and look at the magnitude of the amount of food it took to feed these things. Because it was just it was excess in every level. I mean, it wasn't just a party, it was a drunken orgy, horrible, unspeakable debauchery of these people taking place. But Belshazzar was doing that. He was probably sitting in a seat, kind of elevated on the side of a wall. And archaeologists have actually found a room in the excavation of Babylon that is a very large room with a place in a wall where it looks like there's a cutout plate for a seat, which may in fact have been that place where Belshazzar was. In addition, the scripture describes it as plaster walls. We'll see that in a minute, and that's what they found when they excavated this. But be that as it may, Belshazzar is pretty comfortable that he's okay, doesn't have any worries, even though the Persians are outside. But I have to say to you, this is a guy that just does not have a clear grip on reality. And he's going to prove it over and over again in this little account. He is foolish, and he's going to continue in his foolishness. Verse 2. So while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink of them. This is the height of blasphemy. This is the height of irreverence. He's going to take those vessels that were used in the worship of God in the temple, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken and stored away. Now remember, in those days when a king conquered another king, one of the things they did was they took those religious relics and artifacts of that religion and took them to their own place of their gods, because it, in a sense, substantiated the fact that their gods were tougher, more important, stronger than the gods that had been conquered. So Nebuchadnezzar did this as a normal way of historically treating defeated people. But Belshazzar is going to use those implements of worship as part of his debauchery, a part of his drunken foolishness. It is a direct challenge against the God of the universe. So they go and do this in verse 3. Then they brought the gold and the vessels that had taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, and then they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they not only use those vessels that were in the temple for their drunken foolishness, but they then, worshipped the idols that were before them, that were part of their culture, that had always been part of the Babylonian culture. So, it's a difficult problem that you have when you challenge God. And God tends to answer those challenges. Sometimes he answers them in the near term, and sometimes he'll wait and answer them a little later. Here, God determines to answer the challenge immediately. Belshazzar had sinned against knowledge. He knew the God of Daniel. He knew he existed. He knew the history, the God of his grandfather. He chose to flaunt his evil before him. And God will respond. So, in verse 5, in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of that hand. Okay, so the king's sitting up on his wall on his throne or his chair. There's all of the stuff going on, and everybody's having a good time, and all of a sudden, the party ends. All of a sudden, there's the fingers of a hand begin to write on this plaster wall, and all of the revelry turns to silence, and all of the silence is a reflection of terror. Terror. So, the king's countenance changed. I would say that's an understatement, probably an understatement of exactly what was going on. It says, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against one another. I mean, you get the picture. This is no longer a confident man. He may still be confident that he's okay relative to the enemy on the outside, but to have God on the inside, that's not a good place to be. So, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. There they are again, same group. And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Nabonidus, me, and you. Now, I don't know about you, but with the Persians outside the gate and the writing on the wall, I'm not sure that's a really good prize to have. My guess is when the Persians come through the gates eventually, they're going to be looking for the rulers. So I'm not sure I'd want that title. But essentially what he's saying is, I'll give you a third of the kingdom. I'll give you wealth. I'll give you power. I'll give you whatever it is you want, because I just need to know what this writing means. And so the wise men came in, but they couldn't read it. And we've talked a lot about the fact that they couldn't do anything because they were foolish. And that's essentially a picture of the wisdom of men. The wisdom of men is foolishness, because apart from God, you just cannot know the answers to any of the questions of life or purpose or meaning or anything else. Wisdom comes in and through the Spirit of God, because God is the source of the answers to the issues of man. And so the king, Belteshazzar, was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. In other words, it seems like when they came in, he had a little respite. He seemed to gather his strength a little bit from the initial terror that grasped him. When the wise men came in, he assumed that they might be able to help him with this thing, and it'll all be okay. When they failed, he again goes white as a sheet. I mean, he again finds himself in that place of utter terror and hopelessness. And helplessness. And so he was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. And then enter a lady. Verse 10, the queen. Now this is probably the queen mother, because in that culture it would not be a wife. A wife would never do this. This just isn't something that a wife would do. She wouldn't have the position or the authority. Remember the problem that Queen Esther had when she had to contemplate going before the king uninvited, because the possibility, that literal probability would be that she'd lose her life. So this is probably the queen mother. This is probably his mother, the queen. He says, because of the words of the king and his lords came to the banquet hall, and the queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the holy God. Now again, to have to be reminded of Daniel tells you that Daniel was no longer at the forefront of political affairs in Babylon. But to have him described that way tells you that Daniel is the same man in his old age, which he is now, probably in his 70s, as he was as a teenager when he entered the kingdom. He is a man of great character, a man who is described as the one with the spirit of the holy God. He has the spirit of the holy God, and we've talked about this before. Why do you describe him that way? Because he is of character a holy man. He manifests in word and character the holiness of his God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, again, we believe that's grandfather, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So he had, for an extended period of time, authority over all these guys. But he's never hung out with them. You never find him with them. When they're called, he doesn't come in with them. He comes in later. He's always separated from them. And I think that's, again, a mark of Daniel and how he chose to live in this society that was anti-God, and always was, except for that short period of time when we believe Nebuchadnezzar was saved. And even then, it wouldn't necessarily have changed their society. It was an idolatrous, evil land that Daniel ministered for God in. So, inasmuch as he is the excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting of dreams, solving riddles, and examining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. All it says is Daniel has a wisdom that can answer things that your guys can't. It's a wisdom that comes from God. It's supernatural, and it's in him. He says, and then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" Well, he knows that. He knows who it is, but it's kind of a rhetorical question. "I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellence and wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation to the king. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can, read the writing and make known to me its interpretation. You shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." There it is. There's the offer. And here's Daniel's answer. And then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself." Keep your gifts. I don't want them. I don't need them. And he implied you're not going to need them either. Okay. "And give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation, O king." And then he recounts the history of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar and his being impacted by Daniel's God to bring Belshazzar to the point of understanding of his guilt, before he explains to him the judgment. So he says, God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whoever he wished, he put down. God gave Nebuchadnezzar absolute sovereign authority. Now, it's a little difficult for us, isn't it? We kind of say, well, that doesn't seem fair. I mean, did all those things? He wasn't a nice guy. No, God doesn't promise that the men that he brings into power are nice guys. He just says he brings them into power for his purposes. For his purposes. So as I said, he uses those that love him, and he uses those that hate him to bring about the purposes that he has foreordained. And the ultimate purpose for Nebuchadnezzar is to chasten his people and to protect them for that 70-year period until they can be returned to the land. So, Daniel recounts this, that the problem of his grandfather was pride. And when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he learned the lesson, implied, which you failed to learn, that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses, verse 21. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. You have sinned with knowledge. You are guilty and you are judged. You have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you. You have your lords, your wives, and your concubines. You have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, who do not see or hear or know, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you have not glorified. You are guilty, and so is every sinful person that walks the face of the earth. For this same reason. You are an idolater, and you have not glorified the God who holds your breath in his hands. It terrifies me sometimes. Maybe it's an overstatement. It troubles me. You drive down PV Drive, and you see guys riding their bicycles right out in next to the cars. Guys going by them 30, 40 miles an hour. You see kids riding motorcycles, 100 miles an hour, going down a narrow street. You see young people participating in these super dangerous sports, snowboarding and skateboarding and all this stuff. You see men and women just living their lives with absolutely no concern for God, the one who holds their life in his hands. And they would ignore him, and they would blaspheme him, and they would worship their own little idols, either in their false religion or just in the things of their lives. People would be more concerned, far more concerned, about a play in a football game than they are about their eternal destiny, which is held in the hands of the God that they refuse to acknowledge. We are in the same place. The same place. We do not glorify the God who holds our breath in his hands.